joined us today on a Friday evening. There are many options that people have, but the people who turn up for a session like this are genuinely the interested ones who have an academic bent to their life. So, very warm welcome to this session on demystifying PhD in HR in human resources. We have an esteemed set of panelists today who will lead us through these discussions. I will introduce the moderator. I have the pleasure of introducing my mentor for today. Then I'll request Professor Vijayan to please introduce Zubin sir and Snehal ma'am. So it's indeed an honor for me to speak a few lines about Vijayan sir, who's a Dean of HR and Academics and the CHRO and the Head Career Management Center at V School Mumbai, one of India's top business schools. He's been involved in teaching PG students, designing and delivering MDP program, assignment, assessment development centers, mentoring of students, and other institutional roles for many, many years now. His areas of interest include performance management system, organizational culture, positive employee relations, organization development, and building organizations. Vijayan sir is a gold medalist from the 1984 batch of TISS Mumbai with academic leadership experience of 12 plus years beginning 2009, following a corporate career spanning almost 25 years from 1984 to 2009. Vijayan sir has held several roles in personal management, industrial relations, HRD, OD, total quality management, and manufacturing in a range of industries both in India and overseas. This included a 9 year stint with Marico, where he was the first HR professional to be job rotated as manufacturing head at one of Marico's plant locations. His last corporate role was a director human resource with CHEP in India Private Limited, a Brambles company. He holds a certification in GPHR from CHRI and SHRM CP from SHR. Vijayan sir is currently the president of the NHRD in Mumbai chapter and with EFI as a member of the core committee. In the latter role, he has also been closely associated with the conceptualization and execution of Pathways to Excellence Awards for the Best IR/ER. Five cycles of this program has been completed, and this program was launched in 2020. There are many other things that I can talk about Vijayan sir, but what I like to say about him is he has designed and hosted a lot of business people and user-centric good shows, and he's been with NSID for many years now. So with that, I'll hand it over to Vijayan sir to take the proceedings of the day further.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are not on mute, we please request you to be on mute so that the proceedings can be continued without disruption. Pratima ma'am from NHID in Mumbai and myself will try to place some of you on mute in case you're speaking when the session is on. We do have some Q&A section at the end of this program. So please, if you can help us to keep your questions to the end, that would be appreciated. So with that, Vijayan sir, I hand it over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Arun, for that generous introduction. Very kind of you. You've been a very important mentee to me, and probably you have already outgrown the mentor, is the way I look at things. Having said that, Arun is a batch graduated in 2006, and he's worked with the best Nokia, Deutsche Bank, GE, and now he's based out of Singapore in the large multinational group, American multinational called Danaher. He's a director HR in one of their businesses. I think I've had a long relationship with him, and it's endured over time. And it's great that he's in Singapore and he's helping us host this event. He's also on the executive committee of NHRM. Really happy to have you, Arun. And thanks, Pratima, for also being there. I have the privilege and the pleasure and joy in introducing Professor Dr. Snehal Shah. She is the professor in People and Performance Head at the Office of Research and Innovation called ORI. She's also the chairperson for the Fellow Program Management at the very prestigious SP Jain Institute of Management Studies and Research, Mumbai. We are very fortunate, Snehal. Thank you for gracing this occasion. Snehal is a doctorate holder from Carnegie Mellon University, USA. She has had wide experiences in research, consulting in India and overseas. She's worked in the analytics area, in particular in HR analytics with Nortel Networks, McNeil Associates, and Bank of America. Her consulting and executive education experiences covers ABN AMRO, School of Inspired Leadership. She has been also teaching master's and PhD level programs at top US and European universities. She's a Hogan certified coach, Caliper certified coach, and a reviewer for research journals in US. She's also the founder chairperson of the doctoral program in management, where she's currently associated. And she's also very closely related in strategy, curriculum design, and implementation. It's been an absolute pleasure knowing Snehal Shah. I think we met once before. And I thank you very much for taking your time to grace the occasion for NHRDN's event today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I have equal joy, pleasure, and respect and happiness that I'm bringing Dr. Professor Zubin Mullah, who is the professor at the School of Management and Labor Studies at TISS, my alma mater. He has a mechanical engineering degree from Savitribai Phule Pune University, which is actually a university has got very high acclaim. And then he followed up that with a postgraduate diploma in business management from XLRI Jamshedpur, and then also a PhD from XLRI Jamshedpur. He was in the area of corporate, particularly in engineering design and consulting for 7 years. Now he's an academician for the past 16 years, if I got it right. And as a management consultant, he has worked on large-scale transformation projects in the areas of manufacturing excellence, business process re-engineering, and service quality. Currently, his areas of research interest are transformational leadership, values, impact of Indian cultural beliefs on organizational behavior, meaning of work, very important in the world that we are today, careers, and equally important, evidence-based management. I think many times we face in our profession that we don't have sufficient ROI to talk in the language of the business. He's a prolific publisher, and his articles are adorning Indian and international organizations. I am very happy that we have possibly the best two people one can think of to handle this, I would say, a cerebral topic to begin with. But I think both of them have their own ways to make a cerebral topic also highly understandable. There are three reasons why the chapter felt like doing this program, and most of those thoughts came to me. Number one is the letters PhD. It is a distinguishing factor. You get segregated from the others. And I'm working in a B school where I'm lucky that all my team members are doctorate holders, but I'm not one. So it's a very symbiotic relationship that I'm able to probably give something that doesn't come with the PhD orientation, but I'm also able to get the best from three faculty who are all PhD degree holders. Number two, I believe that even in the managerial role, when we are preparing business management graduates, the emphasis on research and knowledge management mindset is also becoming an expectation of our employers. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say, research. Okay, if you could please, mute the Arun, if you could just check that out, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Yeah. So the research mindset is probably not starting only at a PhD level. Probably we find that there are dissertations and certain PhD principles being followed even at the MBA level. And the last point is more of we believe that there's some value migration away from the MBA. And where is it moving? Maybe it is moving towards advanced MBA, or it's probably somewhere between an MBA and PhD. I thought that such a subject would be very, very useful for the over 100 people who have registered. I think right now we have 58. I'm sure others are joining. And the only caveat is the speakers would not be getting into very specific questions about the institutions that they represent. They would be absolutely open to cover all areas and all concerns, no problem. And that applies to me also. So barring specific questions about three institutions, anything you have a golden opportunity. Both the resource persons prefer that they want to have a conversational approach. So they're not going to make any presentation. Now, whether they would make some opening remarks, I would probably request Zubin sir or Snehal Shah or would you like to straight away dive into the questions? Would it be probably good to, warm the audience with some observations maybe?
Professor Zubin, would you like to go with some opening comments?
Yeah. Thank you, Snail. Thank you, Zubin.
So good evening, everybody. It's really nice to see so much interest in further studies. So, I can just start off by saying that this is one of a PhD in any subject can be one of the most wonderful journeys in a person's life, or it can be a rather painful journey in somebody's life. And I think what determines whether it translates into one or the other is the extent to which you know what you are getting into. So as part of this conversation, and with the leads that you get as a result of what we speak, plus other material online and elsewhere, those of you who are interested in pursuing a PhD in HR, make sure you get enough information and more about what exactly a PhD constitutes, so that you enter into it with your eyes open and you're able to convert it into one of the best experiences of your career. I'll just say this much at now, and then later on with more questions, I will take other questions. Yes, Professor Snehal.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good evening to all, and a very warm welcome. I would just like to add to what Professor Zubin said. I would also like to say that it's a journey which has its ups and downs, but it is also a noble journey, and it transforms you in many ways. So it provides some hurdles that you sort of learn from. It is also a long journey, so you have to have that kind of patience. So it teaches you many life skills that typically, of course, many different corporate jobs also teach you, but this is for the long haul, and it transforms you in many ways, which with knowledge, with skills, and with a mindset that is very different from what you would have approached or addressed in the past with your MBA and other degrees. So if you see like that, then it's a sort of a very, I would say, a noble art and science that you would be pursuing. So more on that as we speak, but very, very happy to be here to have such conversations with you.
Thank you, Snail ma'am and Zubin sir. While we wait for the audience to get a little bit warmed up, probably I have a few questions, and with your permission, may I ask those questions? So probably the million-dollar question is, why do a PhD? I know the answer myself, but I'm sure there are better answers. So why should anybody care that you should do PhD? And y'all are, role models of what you have achieved across the PhD. So if you could share that with our participants, please.
You can go first.
Okay. So since I've had the fortune of managing a program, I just think I would like to speak from more from when others who are interested come and speak to me. What are some of the things? So I'll just divide it up into 2 or 3 things. One is the practical reason. So the practical reason is that I'm a research associate somewhere else. And this is something that I have to do because I'm a lecturer, but this is a requirement as per AICTE, as per all these regulatory bodies. So I would like to get a PhD. So that's the practical reason. But the second one, more important, is that passion and commitment. I would fall into the latter. I always, even as a growing up, I looked up to my professors. I saw them as role models, and something that I would think that I would like to do in my career was something that I was going to create knowledge, I was going to impart knowledge, and that really gave me a lot of joy and happiness. So the passion and commitment are very important to this. So given aside the practicality of it, you will have to understand that do you have the passion and commitment to run a marathon? Because marathon is not something that you will just decide one day and say, okay, I'm looking for a change, and you cannot go into it in a foolhardy manner. I'm not saying you will, but it's just that it's not a sort of a spontaneous instant decision that one day you sort of found it interesting, you looked it up and then you go. Because when you enter into it, there are so many aspects that need to be considered. Your life stage, your what do you want to do afterwards, how do you want to take it forward, and multiple decisions around it. So I would say practicality are many people because of that, and for passion and commitment to sort of contribute to creating and disseminating knowledge. So these are the two sort of brackets that I keep seeing. So 70-80% of the people who come and talk to me about this can be sort of fitted into those two buckets. I'll have Professor Zubin talk about it, and then there are some isolate examples that we can come back to later.
Yeah, thank you, Sneha.
So in my view, there are several reasons why people do a PhD. One is, as Professor Snehal mentioned, people who want to pursue a career in academics. So you like the lifestyle, or you're somewhat attracted to academics and you want a license to enter that new profession. Another reason is that many people feel a lack of intellectual stimulation in their day job. They feel that they've mastered their job pretty much straightforward, and they feel a lot of their cognitive capacities are underutilized in their current job, and they want to look for something little more to interest them and excite them. This is another reason why people may choose to go in for a PhD. Some people simply want to go through the process, because if you look at the way our education system is structured, especially in India, a lot of the things we do is for employment. So we do a graduation, which is the safest graduation to do, most of us, in order to get decent employment. We do an MBA because that was something we had to do to get a decent employment. And PhD is something that people look for as something that they want to do for themselves, as a sense of satisfaction, exploring a particular area in more depth. All three are fine. But in my view, the reason why a person would gain the most in doing a PhD is to learn the art of learning new things. And I think that is an area where the PhD is bang on. If you look at the way we learn, most of us get our learning from textbooks. Typically, textbooks contain verified, validated truths of at least 4 or 5 years old. And then we take our qualifications in year 0, but we are going to be practicing in year 0 plus 20, plus 30, plus 35 as we go through our career. And a lot of things are changing in that career. So what is the mechanism that we have to learn new things? There are two mechanisms. One is we say experience. I've got 15 years experience, I've got 20 years experience, and that's great. But is our experience designed to help us to learn new things? Do we have a way of connecting? Let's say I did a merger in 1 year. I did a downsizing in another year. I did a restructuring in a third year. Is there a way I can get a pattern across all mergers? Do I get any perspective by which I have a view on how all mergers work, or how all downsizing works? Or do I simply get a view onto how I did a downsizing or how I did a merger? So most of our learning is scattered bits and pieces, something like what I would say like a general practitioner. You see somebody with a stomach ache in the morning, you see somebody with a headache in the afternoon, you see somebody with a backache in the evening. You really don't understand what makes stomach aches, what makes headaches, or what makes backaches. The other way we have of learning, and this is very prevalent in HR, is benchmarking. So very often we put students on the job or ourselves, we try to look at what others are doing, and then we try to implement the similar thing in our organization. Nothing wrong in that. But both these forms of learning from one's experience and learning from benchmarking, are somewhat limited because we don't really come to the grips of the problem. Our PhD is a way of, is a systematic way of asking questions. When you learn how to do research, you learn to ask questions in a systematic manner. You don't ask questions which have already been answered in the past. You don't ask questions which are unanswerable. You ask questions in a systematic manner so that there is a potential for answering those questions in a systematic manner again, where relatively those answers are free of your personal biases. And I think that is a skill which will stand each one of us in good stead, even if we don't want to get into academics. Learning to learn.
Okay, I think that's probably
set everybody's mind thinking for follow-up questions, but we already have some interesting questions. So the first one is largely around, I'm already working. It's a bit difficult for me to go back to do GMAT or GRE. So I think the intent of the question is, if I remain as a practicing manager, what are my options to pursue PhD? Any one of you could answer that, or both of you maybe.
Yeah.
So this is a very relevant question, and this is a sort of conversation that goes into whether I do part-time PhD or a full-time PhD. So you do have options where you are looking at saying that, okay, I want to keep my job. I'm at that career stage where I cannot leave it because it, as we are saying that it's a long-term commitment, at least 4 to 5 years, depending on where you are doing. So there are good options for part-time. So for example, barring, so SPJMR, where I am associated with, does not have a part-time. But say I can give examples of MDI Gurgaon, and ISB. So there are private and of course institutes such as the IIMs. They do offer what is called an executive or a part-time PhD. So that option is there, but I would like you to think a little bit higher to kind of say that, why am I doing? So I'll also tell you and give an example of say how the mindset of an American PhD program works, right? So while we are saying that part-time PhD is definitely an option, if you want to go into academia and do rigorous research and of course high caliber teaching, what will happen is that in your part-time model, you will not have as much time to go into the depths. And as Professor Zubin has said about this whole curiosity building, learning to learn, going into the rigor of the art and science of research. So even if and here is what I'm saying, which is I'm demystifying. So I'm kind of giving to that topic is that though part-time looks convenient, looks practical, but depending on the goal and the purpose after you graduate will determine your decision. So don't think about an easy path of selecting. But of course, we have constraints and we financial constraints, life stage constraints. So that definitely is a good option. But be clear about your goal and then figure out whether a part-time or a full-time PhD. And if you decide that part-time is good, then there are many options as resources we mentioned. Even XLRI, in fact, has a very good program, and I've interacted with many of them, and they are very, very good at what they do.
Okay, so Zubin sir, there's a question directed at you. So maybe he's your student. The question, I slightly lost it somewhere. Yeah, he says, I think it was, his name is there. Is it Vijendra Gadve? So I'll read it out for you. I think the question is, Professor Zubin, is it necessary that right at the beginning of my PhD journey, I should be very clear what I want? Or is it a process of self-discovery? Because I might land up in a topic which I'm not interested. So I think both of you have traversed that journey. You are more familiar with it. So this is directed to Zubin sir, please. Thank you.
I'll just briefly add on what Professor Snehal mentioned in the earlier question.
Sure,
so I completely endorse what she said, that there's no substitute to full-time PhD, because you're trying to understand two things. You're trying to understand the length and breadth of the subject before you try to create something new. Second is you're learning the tools of creation, which is research methodology. And it would be, I think singularly the most unique thing that we've ever done in our career. Because until master's level, we are consumers of knowledge. Now, suddenly we are flipping ourselves and becoming creators of knowledge. So the art of creating is itself something which we need to learn, the art and science, which requires a full-time involvement. Having said that, of course, it is difficult for everybody to, quit their job and get into full-time. And there are several part-time programs available, and some of them have been mentioned by Snehal. One could also look at a hybrid approach, which is in the part-time also spend enough time, with the with at the institute of your choice. So ensure that you have 15 days, 1 month, you take those large periods of time away, because very often we notice that creativity requires us to immerse ourselves in certain ideas and thoughts. And when we immerse ourselves in a certain idea and thought for a period of time, then that creative, spark comes. Otherwise, if you're doing it in the weekend like laundry, then perhaps, every Sunday you spend 1 or 2 hours trying to work on your PhD. Somehow it doesn't work for most of us, right? So you can consider that hybrid approach. Now, coming to the specific question as to how clear should I be before I get into PhD, I want to piggyback on Professor Snehal's metaphor of a marathon. Now, suppose you wanted to run the marathon. Question is, how fit should I be before I run the marathon? Shall I develop my fitness while I run the marathon? Or should I develop my fitness before I learn the marathon? I think the question is obvious. In my opinion, admission to a PhD program is a mere milestone. In my opinion, you should start engaging with the literature as soon as this idea has come into your mind. Start engaging with the literature, start reading the right kind of stuff, and we'll talk a little more about that as a few more questions come in. Start engaging with the literature, reading the right kind of stuff, firming up your topic from today. The reason being this, that when you apply for a PhD program, there will be people with different levels of marathon fitness wanting to apply for those few limited seats in that institute of your choice. And at that time, those who are controlling the entry to that program will be trying to ensure that those who are most fit to run the marathon will enter. And we don't want you to lose out over there. You may have great enthusiasm, but if you haven't prepared for the marathon, chances are you will lose out because of the number of seats. So it's not something that you have to do, but given the situation of demand and supply, chances are there will be more takers for the seats than there will be people who are than the vacant seats. So my strong suggestion to you would be to start engaging with the literature. Once you have developed that discipline and you have got a fuzzy idea of your topic, most of us, when we enter our PhD, we always end up changing our topic after we have entered our PhD, or it gets reshaped in a substantial manner. And that's perfectly fine. But I don't think you should wait for the admission to start reading. I think this is a big mistake that many people make. They keep trying for admission. They don't know why they did not get admission. And they say that my scholarship will start after my admission to PhD. I think that is a fundamental mistake, because PhDs do not have a monopoly on scholarship. Scholarship can happen before. And the PhD admission can be an interesting milestone, which then helps you to shape and hone your scholarship in a particular direction.
Thank you, Zubin, sir. Snehal ma'am, I think this is again a very automatic question following this question. How do I look at which institution? So obviously we're not looking at specific, but how do I sort of choose which institution nationally, internationally? And there's a related question, how do I select my guide, or how do I find the person who will take me on this marathon?
Yes, yes. Very practical and relevant. So let me talk a little bit, let me come, because, I draw from my own experience, and then, so I'll speak a little bit about how to choose internationally, and then I will come to which are more.
Yeah, please request Arun, you might have to mute.
Okay. Sorry,
okay. Sorry, Snehal ma'am. Sorry.
Okay. No, not at all. Yeah. And then I'll come back to how do you really select and decide for within India. So, and when I speak internationally, it's mainly United States, because I've spent a considerable time there. There, the matching, so this is like a marriage happens not with the institute and the potential candidate, but it's with the guide or the advisor and the candidate. So that is the marriage that the student, the interested student, has to look at, broker, understand, curate. So I'll just tell you what I did. So I started I said, I want to understand people behavior. I want to do something in organization behavior. And then, as Professor Zubin said, I started reading that there is this whole, some context of what is called psychological contracts. It's about, looking at not the legalities of a contract, but, what are the employer-employee relations. And then the next step that I had to follow is to look at who are the people who are doing it, who are the known guides, professors, researchers, advisors who are doing this. And then some names come up. And I found that one of them leading ones is at Carnegie Mellon. So do understand that I started, in fact, we also have this aspect of being shy. No, how can we write? He or she is such a big person. Will she reply to me or not? But do take out those hesitations, because when you are going to move on this path of sort of a roadmap to a creative path, you will have to shed those hesitations. So, for example, I sent out emails to this professor who's very big in that area, and a few days later she came with a reply. And then I'm just shortening that story, but the thing is that then when your application goes into the institute, then it is that person, that professor, who kind of says, I would like to work with her or this student. And that's how the marriage sort of happens, the connectivity, I would say. So that is more of an international United States kind of perspective. While I'll just take a couple of minutes for India. Yeah. So in India, I would say that there is a balance between the interest area of the student and the institute. So here, institute becomes as important as the professor guide who can guide you. So for example, Bombay University, in fact, it is quite focused, and it will request you to send a research proposal in the application form, and then based on it, if they have a matching and all, they will sort of say that okay, we will select you or not select you. So institutes, some of them have flexibility, some of them say no, whatever the research proposal you've given, as long as we have that person who's doing it, you kind of get into it. While other universities and especially private institutes are more open and flexible about it. So so I would say that when you are looking for options in India, you look at and start reading about the research topic that you are sort of interested, but also marry the institute, what kind of curriculum they have, what kind of flexibility do they provide, and of course what are the eligibility criteria. So there are some questions. So for example, if it is an AICTE approved program, you will have to have a master's degree as a requirement, and you will have to have those entrance exams, and there are a whole host of them. You don't have to give GRE, GMAT, but there are other ones which are also national. So eligibility, some of them for which you are not eligible. For example, you don't have a master's program, then the FPM fellow program, AICTE approved is kind of out of question for you. So these are sort of structural parameters and institutional parameters that weigh in quite a lot. And then of course the research matching and the topic matching. So it's more structural decision, I would say, in India, followed by that, whereas America and other places is quite solely on the research potential of the matching the candidate to the professor. Yes.
Thank you, Snehal. And what you're saying is between India and US, one of the things I learned from you is in India, you have to keep the institution and the program and the professor in mind.
Exactly.
But in the United States, you could actually zoom in on a professor.
That's right.
And then, you sort of told about your own story.
Right.
And sometimes we get somewhat intimidated, like who will respond to us. But in your case, you got a reply very quickly, I suppose, and that should encourage others also.
Yeah, but so, I interacted with her 1 year.
Oh, come on. Okay, so she really
had to start much earlier, not when okay, the application is due in October, let me start in September. It doesn't
1 year,
work. It doesn't work like that.
So Zubin sir, I think this is this question was expected. I think there's one set of questions that are coming from PhD other than academic roles. Is it that PhD means you have to get into academics? And then there's another type of question is, can academics also, meaning persons who are in industry, for whatever reason, what is the scope other than a full-time PhD? Because full-time PhD, everything is very clear. I think these are the two types of questions which have come. So do you see in your experience whether PhDs are getting more traction in companies, learning and development? Maybe Snehal could also have. So Zubin sir?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, almost all the IIMs, almost all, have started an executive fellow program in management, which is equivalent to PhD. Most universities have a very light course load at the moment. Most universities, the course load is very light, which means even though on technically it is not part-time, you don't need to take too much time off. If you were to do a PhD in one of the IITs, most likely you may need to take 6 months to 1 year off from your work, which is, I would say, higher side compared to the university framework. So executive FPM allows you to keep your job as long as you take roughly around 15 days off once in a couple of months, and it will be different depending on the institute, but roughly around that you could keep your job and continue with the executive FPM. University system also will allow you some kind of a hybrid approach where you continue working and you do your PhD, and the IITs would require you a year or so off. And if you do a full-time FPM or a PhD in an IIM or any other private institute, then of course you would need to take 3 or 4 years off, and they would be usually there would be a stipend associated with it. Coming to the second question about what kind of job opportunities are available after one completes one's PhD. So increasingly we are finding, and this has always been a tradition with IIM Ahmedabad. IIM Ahmedabad is one of the oldest PhD programs in management in our country. And you'll find that their alums are doing exceedingly well in professional spaces. You find many heads of HR have a PhD. One of our own alumni, TIS's alumni, Dr. Santruk Mishra, extremely successful professional and business person. So we find PhDs very much sought after. Specifically, they are sought after in areas like management consulting, where you need to solve problems, diagnose issues, deal with data, persuade clients with data. So management consulting is a very natural choice for PhDs to get into. But even other than that, even in line roles, we find many PhDs. And many of these individuals, having completed their PhD or fellow program, after working in industry, continue their association with academics in terms of part-time teaching, etc. And some of these people end up being the best of professors.
Okay.
So I think there are enough and more opportunities, because companies have realized that the kind of incisive approach that a PhD can bring in is valuable to the organization. I also want to briefly touch upon the question that was mentioned about choosing a PhD guide. I think that's a very important choice. And I think the metaphor used by Professor Snehal is appropriate of a marriage, because once you're in, very difficult to get out. So in my opinion, one should look at a couple of things before selecting the PhD guide. The first is look at the person's competence in research. Now, just as in sports, we have different leagues. Somebody plays state level, somebody plays national level, somebody plays international Olympics level. In research also, we have leagues. So the leagues can be figured out by looking at the kind of journals in which people are publishing. Now, everybody publishes. Everybody has got many publications, but that's not enough. You need to go to that second step of trying to see what kind of journals has so-and-so faculty published in, whoever is your target professor for being a guide, potential guide for you. And if you feel that that individual has published in a decent league, which is your aspiration, then it ticks that box of competence. The second issue is of personality and temperament. The personality and temperament match is extremely essential. And the only persons who can tell you about the person's personality and temperament is the people who have worked with that individual as students. So you must go and catch somebody who has worked with that individual as a student to understand what is this person's temperament, because different people need different temperaments. Some people like structured individuals, some people like unstructured individuals. That's the second point. So these are two most important: competence and personality. The third point, which in my view is not so important, but others give a lot of importance, is the topic and the method fit. Okay. So very often what happens is we pick up a topic based on our day-to-day interest, and then we try to look for somebody who has done work in that topic, or we are interested in a particular method and we try to look for somebody in that method. If you get all three, I would say you're very lucky.
Okay.
Competence, personality, and topic method fit. But if I were to give you advice, I would say be flexible on the topic and the method.
Okay.
Because in your whole life, you can always switch that. but getting a guide who is competent and good with you is very difficult. So I would say be flexible with the topic and method. Never compromise on the competence and personality aspects.
Thank you, Zubin sir. Sorry, ma'am, you wanted to say something?
I'm just responding. This is very, I would just add one more. I create those 3 C's that Professor Zubin has already said. Competence, so that is one of my C's.
Okay.
Then he has, I would also put like compassion, you have to have, because it's a tough journey. So that nurturing, so I just to fit in a C, there is some humor here, so compassion. But I also talk, and he spoke earlier, the chemistry. So
Yeah.
competence, compassion, and competence, I also put the method fit. So competence, not only in terms of you're a good researcher and all of that, but what is that method fit or the subject fit? So for me, competence is a more sort of pluralist sort of dimension to it. So just for everyone, those 3 C's are important: chemistry, competence, and compassion, to nurture you as a mentee, nurture you as a researcher. So if those 3 things are there, then the institute and all of that, you mix
Falls
all
into
that,
place.
and then it becomes a good place for you to at least pursue a 4 to 5 years journey.
That was
There was just one question, if I may
Yeah,
answer.
please go ahead.
Somebody is saying, so even somebody is saying that I have a different background, and then can I do a PhD in organization behavior? My answer is, actually, I will give you an evidence-based answer, because just 2 days ago, when I was interviewing for one of my potential candidates for a FPM program, she is a master's in construction management.
Okay.
So the thing is that I do have people who are, say, civil engineers, and then they have actually enrolled into the program. So the answer lies in the fact that how are you going to convince and make the transition between your previous background, whichever that engineer, be it engineering or whatever you have, and organization behavior. And please don't tell the panelists that, oh, I love working with people. So, this is a very undergrad and perhaps, and that doesn't really cut it in a research. So the depth of your answer and the reflection that you have done as to why, not in civil engineering, but in organization behavior, for example, is really going to make it or break it. So do not be discouraged that you have a different background, but you have to do much more homework to get on that panel, to be convincing the panel.
Considered. Okay. Thank you, Snail ma'am, for that nuanced latest observation. You met somebody 2 days back. That's amazing. I think there's another interesting question that's come up, and maybe it's a sign of the times, because the question is there really value for qualitative studies? Now, I presume this question is coming from the preoccupation with big data and algorithms. And so the question is, will there be any traction for, you could call, relatively more qualitative, though I thought that a PhD in HR will have some degree of qualitative. So any thoughts whether the world is moving in some other direction as far as this question is concerned? Thanks.
Maybe I'll start.
Yeah, Zubin sir, go ahead.
So, some of the best papers, if you look at the Academy of Management best papers, you will find that compared to the proportion of qualitative studies which are published, the number of qualitative studies in the best papers is substantially higher. What that means is your ability to come up with something totally new, totally counterintuitive, is very high if you do a good qualitative study. The challenge is that it's very difficult to do a good qualitative study. It's also very difficult to find people who can guide you in a good qualitative study. So the parameters for evaluating a qualitative study are not as simple and straightforward as it is for a quantitative study. And the roadmap for executing a qualitative study is not as cookie cutter straightforward as it would be in a quantitative study, which means you have to be extremely cautious and careful with the kind of guide you select. Ensure that you have a guide who is a expert in that area, and is a seasoned player in that area, has published at the highest level in that area, only then embark into a qualitative. Otherwise, you may find yourself in a little bit of a tricky position when it comes to employment later on, both academic and non-academic.
And non-academic. Okay.
May I answer this?
Snehal ma'am, over to
Yeah,
you.
this is one of my favorite questions. I'll tell you why. Because we as even professors try to demarcate that are we in the quantitative game or the qualitative play, not a game, a play.
Yeah.
In fact, I would like to demystify that myth, because the way, and I'll tell you even from my example, the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing in terms of the rigor of research and publishing is because I was exposed to a bouquet of methodologies. So in fact, you are better served to find an institute where they offer you, and not say that you are bucketed as a qualitative and you will only learn qualitative. So I typically hear that, oh, I'm in marketing, I'm in organization behavior or human resources, therefore and I'm not good at math. So this is also this myth, I'm not good at math, so I will go into the qualitative. Your competence does not dictate your topic, or even where you want to go, the method. The topic dictates your method. So I'll repeat that again. Your competence that you begin with does not dictate what method you choose. That I cannot do math, that's why I do qualitative. It's the topic and the research question that you are asking. And you will not know what research question you're asking, because by the time, it's a journey. So you'll find after 1 year into a PhD program, you'll sort of zone in or fine tune your research question, and then you say, oh my god, I want to for this research question a qualitative methodology is suitable, but I haven't had that training. And therefore a good curriculum is the one that will offer you a fair amount of depth into different methodologies, whether they are quantitative or qualitative. And therefore, my analogy is that you give a bouquet of training in those methods, and then whatever research topic you choose, and then all the things that Professor Zubin has said obviously applies. That qualitative is hard to do. You have to work with a professor who's comfortable with it. They are difficult to publish and all of that. So don't look at your comfort zone, because that's what you have to leave behind and train to become a more of a different training of different methodologies.
Thank you, Snehal ma'am. And that probably leads us to the next question. And I'm also interested because whether you're a PhD or not, whether you're not a PhD student, you need to be aware of where is the conversations going on. So what do you think are the most valuable areas to do research as from the HR, OB space, employee relations? Currently, where do you see the interest happening? And you maybe, potential people could take some cues.
Yes, would you like to go, please?
So, one of the things I've realized after I entered this profession is that things which outwardly look simple, once you start researching them, they become more and more complex. It's like a never-ending, rabbit hole where you keep finding more and more trends. So almost any area which you feel is interesting, if you go deep enough, you will find sufficiently stimulating work happening in that area. Having said that, there are a few, broad trends which one could look at and pick up topics from that as well. So, for example, one of the things that a lot of people are talking about is diversity. As a result of COVID, this whole work from home, technology in HR, talking about employee experience, various future trends in HR, future of work, internationalization, global careers. These are some of the things that are being talked about. In my opinion, one should not get too much carried away by this when it comes to research, because the likelihood of you getting a guide in several of these emerging areas and your ability to find somebody who will be able to guide you in some of these areas may not be possible easily, because the people who are currently guides will be people who have taken their PhDs, let's say 10, 15 years back, when some of these areas were not there. So even though it is good to look at recent topical areas, you have to be a little cautious to see whether you will be able to find a guide who's latched onto some of these areas.
Okay. Snail ma'am, would you like to add?
Research, he has already, Professor Zubin has already spoken quite a few. What I see as what my organization behavior and HR students, scholars are taking up are 2 or 3 things. There's this whole concept of well-being, because it's also spoken and, well-being, happiness, that. So a different dimension of employee engagement, if you were to say that. Why well-being? Of course, because of COVID, and physical and mental well-being has become primary in even the offices, HR offices and CHROs are very, very concerned about it. So well-being has kind of bubbled up to the top. So that is one topic that I would like to add. And the other one that is coming up, and I think this is a global, I'm reading, is this whole concept of resilience. So resilience, in fact, it's at 2 levels. It is individual resilience, how do we become resilient to what we are going through, but also organization resilience. So that is kind of a new and upcoming topic. But beyond that, I think I see, and I'm quite interested in this topic, which is also, there are many international conference, is this whole concept of what is called psychological capital. So we have been initiated in capital as, money, labor, the economics of all of that. But psychological capital, what are those? Hope, optimism, resilience, and self-esteem. So these are the 4 things that make up what is called a psychological capital. And how do you increase it, enhance it? What do you do? And of course, as Professor Zubin said, you go deeper into it and you will find so many offshoots and branches and sub-branches that you may say you are looking at psychological capital, and it may lead to well-being and say, okay, now I'm more interested in that. So those kind of inner tunnels happen, but you have to really immerse yourself deep to understand those nuances.
Okay. So what I heard from you is there are some trending topics because of the contextual situation, but that should not be the driving, because as Zubin sir rightly said, so-called areas which may seem it is over-researched and is so simple. What Zubin sir said is actually it's not so simple. There could be completely new paradigms in something that has been beaten around the bush. So really, it's not necessary. It's not a fashion that one has to get connected to the trend. I hope I have understood it right.
Can I qualify that a little bit?
Yes,
so
please,
while we should not take it as a fad or a fashion, you do see that when you are looking at publication and research and submitting your papers in international conferences, you do see that these they are topical, and they're topical in terms of contemporary aspects. And as you put in very nicely, that, those tried and tested topics, say job satisfaction or job characteristics model, even if you take those classical things and the context is a new context or an emerging economy or all of that. So I would not say that you pick up as a fad or a fashion, but you be pragmatic and be little bit flexible to select something that may give you that long run leverage to publish something which multiple journals are publishing. And so keep an eye on contemporary, at the same time focus on your interest and your passion. And if there is some marrying the 2 of them, that would be ideal. But of course, do not just run like a rabbit, just finish the race.
That's a very interesting question asked by one of the participants. In fact, I do know him. He's from the finance profession. He's an independent finance professional. He says the COVID pandemic has crunched the time taken for biological research. I presume, the speed at which a vaccine has come. And I suppose the intention is a PhD in HR or maybe any area other than sciences. I think, nice to see you, Milan. he's saying when will is there a possibility that this time for a PhD, might get crashed? I think he's based on if biological research can move somewhat faster than what it used to move before. Do you see any implications, positive implications on mainstream research in humanity, social sciences, etc.? Milind, I hope I got the question right. Yeah, you're mute, Milind. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, thanks for taking up the question. The crunch in the biological research, the vaccine development has been amazing. It is not a percentage crunch. It's a several times crunch from something like 8-9 years to 8-9 months. So I expect that this methodology of accelerated research should logically get extended to other streams of research. It's partly a wishful question, because at my stage of life, if I want, I do want to do a PhD, but the longer I wait, worried about the time it takes for research, the lesser are the possibilities that I'll ever do it.
Yeah, who wants to go?
Well, maybe this is the subject matter of research in itself.
Or probably we had to have another webinar based only on the single point question. Yeah, any thoughts, Neha, ma'am?
Mine is a very quick answer, and I'm sorry if I, go into my background and say. So, for example, it is not wishful thinking. It depends on the institute. So, in fact, you can choose some institutes where they say, okay, I just heard that somebody finished in 3 years. I'll tell you that I know a gentleman, a family member, who finished at Carnegie Mellon in 3.5 years, and that was a black sheep. He was considered to be the black sheep of the PhD program, because though his guide advisor allowed him to do so, but there is this whole peer body who say, how can somebody from Carnegie Mellon finish in 3.5 years? Of course, it was before COVID and all. So I'm saying that I think there are certain universities, especially research oriented, even in India and abroad, who will correlate a faster PhD to diluting the caliber of offering of the PhD content. So as long as that correlation perception remains, then those institutes and organizations may not do it. However, having said that, I think COVID has upended many business models, and hopefully for some institutes, they've upended even the research model and say that, okay, how can we crunch it and give it to you and allow you to do in X number of years. So that's just my practical kind of answer. But many universities will not go that path.
Thank you. I see it as a struggle between the PhD haves and the PhD have-nots.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
I mean, those who are guides and who have already acquired their PhDs, they say that we took a long time.
Saas bahu ka sawal hai na.
Saas bahu ka sawal hai, exactly.
And go ahead and ask your question, please, Suraj.
Hello, everyone. So my question essentially is, I've just started my journey in doing masters in HR, and I'm an HR professional. My question, since the start of my career, I've always been very ambitious to do a PhD program sometime in my career. I just wanted to get an advice on, according to the panelists here, what would be the right age or the right juncture of your career where you should be doing a PhD program? And what are the tools that one needs to have before that person makes up his mind to sign up for a PhD?
Yeah, you want to answer first?
Sure, I can go. As on the other side of the table, we do not really look at the age. I'll tell you why. We look at the following. We look at aspects what are called academic competence. So even if you've done 40, 50, 20, 30 years ago, and you might be of that age, if you come back to the classroom, will you be able to understand and apply the rigor of those, quantitative methods, the methodologies, what is recent, contemporary, current, which is quantitative and qualitative. So that is one indicator for us. The second one, which is more intangible but very important to us, is what is called research aptitude. Do you have that at least potential and the ability to go deeper into aspects? One research paper can take about 8 or 10 hours to read, and you would have to read 3 times, 4 times to even understand the purport or the purpose of this whole thing, and forget about the methodology that they might have used if it is a heavy duty quantitative.
Hello.
Do you have that stickability and that is just
Hello?
one aspect of the research. Passion, commitment, motivation, all of that kind of fits into that research aptitude thing. So if those two, and in fact we have examples in our program where people are beyond a certain age, I would say beyond 40 years of age, who are part of it because we saw all of that, and then we said that he or she would be a good candidate in the program, who will withstand the rigor and the passion and the commitment and the research aptitude. So I would say do not be discouraged by whatever age that is, but look at these aspects and see these are the things we see on the other side of the table.
Okay.
I just want to add a little bit to this,
Yeah,
and also respond to one question which I saw online. So somebody put a question online that, look, I don't want to do research, but I just want to do a PhD.
Okay.
Now in the US, they have certain what is called as professional or industrial doctorates, like what is called, like you have a DBA in Harvard, where the research component is relatively lesser. Of a law you have, of a psychology you have something. Unfortunately, in India, I have not seen that yet opening. So today, all the PhD programs in management in India are geared towards one goal, that is focusing on research training. Hopefully, as the education sector gets liberalized, there will be more such, professional doctorates coming up, where you don't necessarily move towards a thesis or a dissertation or research kind of training, and it's for a different kind of audience. But today, to best of my understanding, they don't exist. So when you are admitted to the program, people will look at your intention to do research. And if you say that I'm not interested in doing research, that will be a clear, no-go when it comes to admission into any program in India as of now. This is to the best of my understanding.
Okay. So,
All right. Thank you so much.
Zubin sir and Snehal ma'am, I'll request Vijendra to, you had asked a question on the chat, but I thought that was a little personal question. So if you have a new question, please ask. Otherwise, you'll have to take it offline. Vijendra?
Sure, sir. I mean, my second question was that how can we improve our academic writing skills first? Because though along with my job, I do like to do small studies, and sometimes case studies are also prepared by me. But somewhere, whenever I give it for maybe publication, sometimes it gets accepted, sometimes there is a rejection. So I just want to know, I mean, how can I improve my academic writing skills, sir?
Can I take this? Yeah. So yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, PhDs do not have a monopoly on scholarship. And anyways, as a practitioner, after your master's, it is perfectly legitimate and desirable that you engage with scholarship in your discipline. And it's great that you're writing cases. One of the things that you could consider doing is to partner with an academic in writing cases, because that is where you will get the much needed complementary skills from somebody whose job it is to write, where it will get you started on your journey. And cases is a great way to start, because one thing we have as practitioners with us is data and stories. The academic is looking for data and stories from the real world to be got into the classroom. So what you need to do is, if you have a problem relating to supply chain, find an expert on supply chain who has published cases in the area of supply chain, partner with him or her, write 1 or 2 cases. If you have an issue in talent management, find somebody who has written cases on talent management, partner with that person. It is incredibly satisfying. And that will get you started on your writing journey. There are other courses on academic writing. If you go online, there are several university academic writing courses which are available online, which can help you to get started. that would be a good way to get started. There is also something known as publicationacademy.com. It has recently come up, and they have paid courses, though I don't know how good they are. I have not met anybody who has done those courses, but there are such trainings available online.
I just request.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Just request everybody to mute their audio so that we can listen to the resource persons better.
If I can just add from what Professor Zubin has said, that while you can write, that's a great way of doing it. Even if you read, say for example, you want to publish in a certain case publishing house, say Ivy Business School, that's one of the publishing houses, or say I'm Ahmedabad, so reading what they want, what they require, what has been published, what is really the way it is written, and then you sort of try to curate and craft your writing according to that. You learn a lot, which is also the concept called vicarious learning. So you learn from others, learn from other writing, and that itself, I have seen many people improving their writing when they do not have exposure to other parts or do not have opportunities. That's a great way to learn too.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Snail ma'am. We have in this order waiting to ask questions is Ambud Jain. He's been very patient, followed by Rahul, Ravindran, and Mridula. Ambud Jain, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Vijayan.
Pleasure.
My question is, what are the contents of a research proposal and how does one go about creating the proposal? Because that is the first step. Without that, I mean, you can't even begin to on your path.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I'm sure the resource persons will respond.
Professor Subin, should I? So what we typically say that because this is a question which keeps coming to our doctoral program. So we have to go about what AICTE says, because we are an FPM approved. But barring that, typically, I would just tell you 2 or 3 steps that it is about, they say 4,000 to 5,000 words. You can also be less depending on which institute, but that. Now we give a structure and a template, and we do have webinars and seminars and all that, just which says, how do you write a research proposal? So I do encourage you, wherever it is being talked about or spoken about, you should go and look at it. But there are 4 or 5 sort of steps that you take. Basically, we are looking at what is the motive. So if you're talking about what motivates you to do this particular or address this particular question, right? So motivation, the why of things. So why is very primary in this. So the front end, the introduction and all of that has to really move towards talking about, I'm suddenly interested. So many people have lost their jobs. So I'm trying to, World Economic Forum has said this. So basically, even if it starts with a practical motivation, you kind of, so we call it a filtering mechanism to come to something that, and therefore I'm interested in addressing this topic or that topic. So it's the why, right? The motivation. Then what you want to study. So what will really then talk about, you zero in to say, this is the research, broadly, this is the research topic, and this is where I want to go. So you will have to sort of put some literature review. So at least you have to read some papers, look at some depth and say that these things have been talked about, but this particular question is something that and you can't just say, I'm interested in doing this topic, right? It has to be really spoken that research has seen all this, I'm interested, but this is the gap, and that's why I want to fill that gap. And then so the why, the what, and then you kind of sort of write in those how you're going to do. So a little bit of a flavor in terms of what is the methodology. And there, if you are kind of writing that I want to collect, I want to do interviews, or I want to collect data on a survey. So that kind of, makes you kind of look at the quantitative, qualitative. So this is very, very rough. But you basically start with the why, how, and what. But before you do that, you have to read so much about it so that you can bring that into a 3,000 or 4,000 words. Yeah, over to you, Professor.
I'll just add a little bit to what Professor Snehal said. So I suggest you first start with a broad area. So for example, within HR, what are you interested in? Are you interested in HR or IR? Are you interested in macro or micro? Macro as in policy level, what should organizations do as a whole? What kind of HR policy should the organization have? Or are you looking at what should a manager do? What should an individual do? Are you looking at individual behavior? Are you looking at group behavior? So find a broad level interest. Like for example, at a master's level, if you had several chapters in your textbook of HR or textbook of OB, which chapter are you interested in? So that's like what we call a broad area. Second step is try to identify a couple of top journals which talk about that area. So if it's IR, then look at which are the top IR journals. If it's to deal with something like labor economics, which are the top labor economics journals? If it's pure HR, then which are the top journals in HR? For that, I recommend there is Financial Times list of 50 journals. So these 50 journals are top journals in management. Within those management journals, chances are you will find 10 or 12 relating to HR/OB related subjects. The benefit of this is that assuming that time is limited, you're not going to read all kinds of stuff which is available online, because everything is available online. You'll find stuff on future of work and work from home and all kinds of stuff online, and you've got limited amount of time. So it's better to read only stuff which is at the cutting edge of knowledge. And to look at what is at the cutting edge of knowledge, you have to look in the right places. And the right places to look at are the top journals. So your first task is to find out which are the top journals in my field. In fact, the only intelligent question you should ask to any expert is not what is a good topic for me to do study on, but which are the top journals that I should look at. Once you have answered that question as to which are the top journals I should look at, then you focus on last 2 or 3 years of those top journals. Do not get carried away with what was said in 1940, 1950, etc. Most of it would have been revised. In the last 3 years, what is the buzz that is being talked about? So try to get your hands on those articles. It may be difficult to get the full text of that article. There are some sources like Google Scholar, ResearchGate, academia.edu, and of course, writing to the authors. You very often get a very quick response when you write to somebody. It's very flattering. You tell somebody, send me your paper. They usually do respond to that. Once you have last 3 years good articles relating to your area of interest, towards the end of each article, the authors themselves talk about what are the unanswered questions. What are the directions for future research? If you're able to build your house on the foundation which has been built by the giants that have come before us, you know you are on solid ground. And then your proposal stands some chance of getting shortlisted. So based on those recent articles, you will not only understand what is the area which is people are asking questions about, but you will also recognize what are the ways in which people are answering those questions. So is it an experiment? Is it a survey research? Is it a case study research? Are they looking at secondary data? And that will give you the raw material to flesh out your proposal. While making the proposal, please make sure that each and every word in that proposal is your own language. Do not copy and paste anything which has come in any other printed place. Read what is written, understand it, keep it aside, and write it in your own words and language. And then within brackets, you credit the author from where you have picked it up. Because if you plagiarize, you will again get into trouble at the time of admission. In my opinion, that is the most efficient way of getting your proposal ready. Don't get carried away by fads and read online that, you know, some management guru said this or some consultant said this. Don't get carried away by that, because that will not help you to come to a research proposal, even though that may be relevant for practice. Your task at the time of writing a research proposal is to get into the program and to get a researchable problem.
Thanks, Zubin sir. Rahul?
So I just want to say that whatever Zubin said, this is an offer to NHRDN that if there is something, you know, what is plagiarism and what are those rules and all, we would be happy to share those resources, because, you know, we are offering those as workshops. So with the right permissions, we can share those resources.
Thank you, Sneha. Mridula, finally, please ask your question.
This has been well worth the wait, Professor Vijayan. So thank you.
Thank you for your appreciation. Yeah.
Dr. Snehal, Dr. Zubin, it's been a very, very enriching way of spending Friday evening.
Can you speak a bit louder, please?
Yeah, we are not able to hear you properly.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Not being heard is not one of my usual problems. So thanks for pointing that out. A very enriching conversation. I must thank you from the bottom of my heart for being so patient with answering questions. I'm going to ask what sounds like a bit of an ABC, but I'm super committed and feeling rather overwhelmed. So I'm hoping you can help, right? If I were to think about my constraints, I mean, to do a PhD, expense is less of the issue, time is more of the issue. So if I were to start with that constraint, and also to introduce myself, I'm a TIS MA HR pass out from 2008. I'm working with a top FMCG for the past decade and more. I'm really keen on a PhD for the sake of deeper understanding of the subject I'm embarking on. So it's not a means to an end in another way. And I'm also looking at this as what I used to think was a part-time option, but basis what both of you have laid out today, I just know that I want to try and keep my job and do the PhD too. So that's the starting point. If there was an ABC into where do we start, how do we decode just between, do we start with an international university versus an Indian one? And then the question I'd asked earlier on chat, it seems like a bit of a chicken and egg story on topic, guide, and university. So if there was a step 1, step 2, step 3 for someone like me, what would that be?
Thank you, Mridula.
Thank you.
I'll take this.
Okay.
So Mridula, I suggest in step 1, you look for a program which suits your needs in terms of a institute which suits your needs. And as I said, most of the IIMs have an executive fellow program which will meet your requirements. And once you have looked at that executive fellow program, then start looking at the list of faculty who are in the discipline of your interest, which I'm guessing is OB/HR. And within OB/HR, look at the faculty, try to understand their interests, and try to find some area which is aligned to those interests. And then, as I mentioned, you talk to some of the ex-students in that particular course who are currently doing the course, so that you understand the temperament of the faculty whom you are targeting. And then if the temperament and their competencies kind of match with your interests, then try exploring a topic relating to that. That will maximize your chances of getting through that particular institute. And they may have other requirements in terms of having an entrance exam, etc. Prepare for that as well. Okay. So start with an institute which has the flexibility that you need. Yeah. So some may say so many visits, so many times a month. Then the location may be closer or far away depending on your preference. Because IIMs are scattered all over the country. Yeah. So I would say start with an institute which meets your, and then within that, the faculty pool. So older institutes usually have more senior or more seasoned faculty. Not necessarily, but usually, you know, A, B, C, L, Indore, etc. These are the ones which have more, and ISB also has a good executive FPM program. You could have a look at that as well.
I would say that all of these things are very important to do. And before you do all that, you kind of create your own horoscope on a piece of paper. And what would that look like? It would all you say that you have to really be very honest with yourself to say, when why am I doing PhD? So of course it's very broad, but you know, so you can break it down to say that, okay, after I do I want to go back to industry, or I want to be in academia? I'm doing it because, you know, it gives me the most noblest and PhD, and then after that, whatever I do, it doesn't matter. Or you are saying that I have these constraints. I want those who give me stipend or who do not give me stipend, you know, those kind of. So as ISB has pointed out, it's a fabulous program. It costs, I think, if you're not an academic, it is 48 lakh rupees. So though executive PhDs come quite expensive, I mean, not as much as ISB, but you know, in that range. But I think that your answer or focus search will come through when you are clear about what you are really going in it for. So it is fine that you've said that it's my passion, commitment, I want to do it, time is a constraint. So yes, executive PhD. But so for example, XLRI will give you a lot of research rigor and of course teaching. So if you say that, okay, I'm okay for research, but you know, I just want to be a visiting faculty and a teacher and continue my FMCG job. If that is the thing, maybe XLRI, even if it is a great program, but with the focus on research and taking 6, 7, 8 years, that may not be that. So you have to sort of create that roadmap for you, and then exactly what Professor Zubin said, that then the IIMs or the private universities or whoever offers, then it's just a short list, right? Because there are only few IIMs and many IIMs, but few private universities who give that executive. And if, finance of that kind of expense and all, you can say that, so you can actually narrow down to just a few that you can apply to. But you have to be clear what you're looking at the end of the day outside that tunnel.
Thanks, Snail ma'am. We are coming. Thank you, Mridula. You gave a very difficult question. It was nice that you answered, because there may be people in this webinar who wanted to ask that question, but you sort of articulated their voice also. Thank you. We are coming into the home stretch, and there's a colleague of mine who's also a committee member is asking, I think, a very important question. Both of you could answer. We live in a world which is changing faster than one can imagine. Many PhDs are possibly becoming outdated soon. Some regulatory bodies also understand this phenomena. Should professional qualifications become, I don't know, as important as academic or more important? That is the question. So I'm sure this question you must have handled it 100 times. So I think it's probably a deeper question coming from an institutional leader's perspective. So any thoughts on that?
Zubin, you want to go ahead?
Sorry. If professional qualifications were really up to the mark, then most of us could learn how to learn in masters itself. But for whatever reason, professional masters qualifications often do not reach the level of rigor that one would expect from a master's qualification. And in an ideal situation, the master's qualification would be upgraded sufficiently so as to ensure that a person is equipped for life to access, interpret, and apply research as and when it is coming out. And a PhD may not be necessary, and a PhD may be required only for those few people who want to get into academics or want something really deep. But today, I don't see that happening. Maybe we are a couple of years away from that. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think some perspective is.
Yeah, I would like to say it's not either or. In fact, in India, we are very well positioned because we have the rich context of this whole professional corporate understanding, and then we can kind of make that bridge to understand the research and the qualities that are required and the art and science. So in fact, if we were to provide the combination in terms of an applied research focus, that we take interesting problems from our professional environment, from our professional qualifications, and then apply the rigor to it, then we are in fact better able to manage or come up with interesting problems to be solved, or new knowledge creation. But a second interesting trend I would like to say, and I know we are out of time, is that globally, world over, there is a lot of talk happening on terms of what is the impact of my research. Who are people who are using it? Is it just being put in the shelves or in top journals and the citation score, because number of people who are quoting us, citing us. So they are moving from saying we are going from that aspect to more of the how impactful our research is. So that way there is a lot of hope and optimism for an applied sort of combination of professional and research oriented. So it's not an either or answer, it's an and answer.
Thank you, Snail ma'am. We absolutely have run out of time. It's like a television host being told, your time is up. So Arun, where are you? I hope you can switch on, and we probably can do a vote of thanks together, maybe, for our guests and participants. So over to you.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much, Vijayan sir. Like, this is one of those moments, where somebody who's like a sport boy in a movie gets a chance to act in the movie. So I'm really happy, be playing that part.
Yeah,
but Zubin sir has been my professor from TISS. While I've never attended a class from Zubin sir, I've seen a couple of videos Zubin sir has gone live. And Snehal ma'am, like I told you earlier, when we were discussing about this discussion in the NHRDN committee, a lot of people said the one person that we need on this group is Snehal ma'am. And today I know the reason why from the inputs that you shared. So big vote of thanks from my side to both of you. Despite your busy schedule, you made the time to come. We had 78 participants at the peak of our session. And the fact that 50 of them continue to stay towards the end on a Friday evening, where typically, people want to do many other things after a busy week. It's really a, testament to the fact that it was a very value-adding session. So big thanks to both of you for making time and sharing your insights. We'll all try to learn, and unlearn and relearn and try to make things better as we go. But I love the analogies that you shared, the insights that you shared, coming from your rich experience. It really, gleaned a lot of wisdom to all that, everyone who participated. So thank you once again. I would also like to thank Vijayan sir, because this whole idea germinated from Vijayan sir. While he might not say that, but in the committee, he was the one who said there could be an audience who might need something like this. And actually, when we sent out the invites, we had more than 260 people who registered for this program, which I thought was very encouraging. So what we will do is we'll edit this video. We'll first send it to you, and then we'll also publicize it on YouTube so that others who couldn't attend today can possibly still benefit from the insights. So thank you, Vijayan sir, for seeding this thought and nurturing it into a plant and ultimately delivering the fruits to everybody who participated in the session today. A big thanks to all of you on behalf of NHRDN and Mumbai chapter and all the participants who benefit from the session today. Thank you again.
I endorse everything what Arun said. He has made it a much more beautiful vote of thanks. I thank my colleagues on the executive committee and Snehal ma'am and Zubin Mullah for being so kind and liberal and large-hearted. It was a real spectacle. Thank you so much. We hope to get you back on similar platforms sooner than later. And thanks to all the participants who stayed on till the end on a Friday evening. Deeply respect. We have a program coming up in the month of October. Do join that also. You will get details very soon. Pratima, thank you for the backup support, and your presence is always. Thank you very much. Thanks once again to Zubin sir and Snehal ma'am, our guests for the day, who were the real show stealers for our show today. Thank you so much. We will be relying on your wisdom for future programs as well. Thank you so much.
Just one request.
Yes, Snehal ma'am.
It's our honor, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Sir, just one request. So we will share the link in the chat box for the feedback, and participants can, share their feedback with us.
Okay, do that.
Yeah.
Do that. Can they email the answer? Or they have to do it now only.
We can. I mean, we'll just share, or maybe we can. I can email them also.
I think that's better because
that will be better.
People are probably dropped off. Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and God bless. Have a good weekend, Zubin sir, and
wish you the same.
Neha ma'am, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
for
Fatima.
all the
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, Arun.
Thanks, Zubin sir. Thanks, Arun.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zubin. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, man. Bye.